In a universe where loyalty is priced by blood, and freedom is a luxury few can afford, two fugitives cross paths. One a ghost from the darkest shadows, the other a dreamer flying a dying ship against bounty hunters, ancient powers, and the crushing cold of space. They will fight not just for survival, but for a future worth believing in. The bounty board's holographic display flickered against the dim haze of Nivra Terminal's cantina. Its list of wanted fugitives hovered above the heads of mercenaries and smugglers nursing their drinks. At the top of the list, pulsating in a menacing green hue, was a name that could silence a room. Serica Enrule. The image of her face glared out from the projection green skin, smooth and flawless, despite its sharp, predatory angles. Her piercing black eyes seemed to stare back at anyone brave or foolish enough to look at the board. The reward was staggering. 10 million credits, dead or alive. Below her image, the description was blunt and foreboding. Wanted for assassination, mass murder, theft of galactic intelligence. Extreme caution advised. At that moment, Zeraka didn't feel like a deadly assassin. She felt like prey. Her lungs burned as she sprinted through the back alleys of Nivra Terminal. The air here reeked of rust and decay, a sharp contrast to the gleaming corporate facades of the upper levels. Shadows danced wildly around her as she darted past malfunctioning neon signs and piles of scrap. Her boots barely made a sound against the grates beneath her feet, but the distant ping of a bounty hunter's quantum tag was relentless. Zeraka pressed herself into the shadows, her back against a jagged wall. She clutched the hilt of the blade strapped to her thigh, its grip familiar and reassuring. Her breaths were controlled, shallow, though her pulse roared in her ears. She had survived worse, far worse still. The stakes were higher now. These weren't the standard desperate bounty hunters she debated for years. These were professionals, likely Void Covenant, funded, armed with military-grade tech. She'd seen them in action before. They didn't give up, and they didn't take prisoners. Her green skin a mark of her people. The Thalassari shimmered faintly under the station's dim lighting. Once her kind had been revered across the galaxy for their unmatched agility and endurance, but now Thalassari were few and scattered, often exploited as hired killers. Zeraka had been one of the best, maybe still was. But after years of bloodshed and betrayal, even she wasn't invincible. The quantum tag's ping grew louder, sharper, echoing in the narrow passage. Zeraka's muscles tensed, ready to spring. She had one rule: never stop moving. She darted around the next corner, her hand grazing the hilt of her blade. Her mind raced. The freighter docks were a few alleys down. If she could reach one, she might slip aboard a departing ship, and she collided with something solid. The impact sent her staggering back a step. Her vibroblade was out before she even registered what or who she'd hit. The blade's edge gleamed under the faint neon lights as she leveled it at a man's throat. He froze, hands raised. Whoa, okay, let's not make this a stabbing situation. Her black eyes locked on him, narrowing in suspicion. He was human, tall but lanky with a wiry frame that didn't suggest much strength. His shaggy brown hair stuck out at odd angles, and his clothes were a mismatched patchwork of worn fabric and scintille ether. His jacket was particularly hideous, in oversized monstrosity that had clearly seen better soul arcs. Move, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Gladly, he said, not moving an inch, but you might want to take a second to... A shrill beep interrupted him. Kaida's blood ran cold. The quantum tag was close, too close. Friends of yours? He asked, glancing down the alley. Quiet. She snapped her vibroblade, still poised. She turned her head slightly, scanning the dim corridor for movement. The faint red glow of a targeting laser flickered against the wall to her left. "Listen," the man said, his voice remarkably calm for someone with a blade at his throat. "I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but unless you enjoy being vaporized, we should probably go." "Go now, wow." Her gaze snapped back to him, her grip on the vibroblade unwavering. "Why would you help me?" He grinned a lopsided, boyish smile that made him look absurdly out of place in a death-stakes chase. "Call it a bad habit. Also, I really don't want to get shot because I happen to be standing here." Another beep, louder this time. The bounty hunters were closing in. Kaida weighed her options. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. But staying here was suicide. "Fine," she said, lowering the blade. "But if this is a trap, I'll gut you." "Noted," he replied, remarkably unfazed. "Follow me." The man took off, moving with surprising speed and confidence through the labyrinthine alleys. Kaida followed close behind her eyes, scanning every shadow for signs of an ambush. He led her through a narrow passage that opened onto a dingy docking bay. The air here was thicker, tinged with the acrid smell of burning fuel and overheated engines. In the center of the bay stood a freighter that could generously be described as functional. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched panels, scorched and dented from what looked like years of hard use. The name Starborn Relic was crudely painted along the side in fading letters. "This is your ship?" Kaida asked, her voice dripping with disdain. He shot her an offended look. "Hey, she's got character, and she flies most of the time." Ion disruptor fire erupted behind them, cutting off any further commentary. "Right now," he shouted, slamming the control panel to lower the ramp. Kaida didn't hesitate, sprinting up the creaking ramp as bolts of plasma whizzed past her. The man, Jax Orion, she realized he'd called himself, was right behind her, the ramp closing, just as a plasma bolt scorched the hull. "Hold on, Jax," Orion said, leaping into the pilot's seat. His hands moved with practiced ease over the controls, flipping switches and adjusting levers as the ship roared to life. The engine sputtered for a moment before surging with a deafening roar. The ship shuddered violently as it lifted off. Kaida grabbed a nearby railing for balance, glaring at Jax Orion. "You call this flying? I call it improvising." He shot back, grinning as he maneuvered the freighter out of the docking bay. Outside, the stars stretched into a blurred tapestry as the ship jumped into hyperspace. Kaida exhaled slowly, her muscles finally relaxing. For now, she was safe. But as she looked over at Jax, Orion still grinning like a fool as he piloted his battered freighter. She couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles had only just begun. The Starborn Relic groaned as it broke free of Nivra Terminal's gravity, lurching into open space like a wounded animal. Kaida braced herself against the ship's bulkhead, her sharp eyes scanning the cockpit. The console was a mess. Cables hanging loose, panels held together with tape, and a blinking light labeled Engine Temp, glowing an ominous red. "Is this thing held together with glue?" she asked, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Jax." Orion didn't glance back. Glue would have been an upgrade. He flipped a series of switches with practiced precision, his easy grin betraying no concern over the freighter's obvious state of disrepair. Kaida studied him with cold intensity. He didn't look like much messy hair, worn-out jacket, and a carefree attitude that grated against her instincts. Yet there was something unnervingly deliberate about his movements. He wasn't the hapless fool he pretended to be. The stars outside streaked into a blower as the ship entered hyperspace. Only then did Jax Orion swivel his chair to face her, his grin softening into something almost curious. "All right," he said, leaning back casually. "Now that we're not being shot at, mind telling me what's going on? Or do I have to guess?" Kaida crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to know. See, that's where you're wrong, Jax." Orion gestured around the cramped cockpit. "You're on my ship now. If I'm risking my neck for you, I deserve answers." She considered him for a moment, weighing her options. Trust didn't come easily. She'd seen too many betrayals, survived too many ambushes, yet Jax. Orion wasn't acting like someone after the 10 million credit bounty. "You know who I am," she said, finally, her tone clipped. "Kaida and Rule," he replied, his grin returning. "Galaxy's deadliest assassin, wanted in 17 systems, allegedly." She raised an eyebrow. "Allegedly." He shrugged. "People exaggerate. Maybe you're not as scary as they say." Kaida took a step closer, her presence radiating quiet menace. "Do you want to test that theory?" "Jax." Orion raised his hands, palms out. "Nope. I'm plenty convinced." Her glare lingered before she stepped back, returning to her place by the bulkhead. For a moment, the hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. "What's your angle?" she asked, breaking the quiet, my angle. "You helped me. No one does that without a reason, Jax." Orion tilted his head as if the question amused him. "Maybe I just don't like bounty hunters," she snorted. "Try again." "Fine," he said, his grin fading. "Truth is, I've been on the run too. Not for anything big, smuggling a little contraband here and there, but I know what it's like to be hunted. Figured you could use a break." Kaida frowned, her suspicions still intact. "You're awfully relaxed for someone who just outrun professional killers." "Relaxed," he laughed, leaning forward. "You think I'm not scared out of my mind. But what's the point of panicking? Doesn't help anyone." His answer surprised her. Most people would be groveling or trying to sell her out by now. Jax Orion, for all his strange charm, was an enigma. "You're an idiot," she said bluntly. "Probably," he agreed. Kaida followed him into the ship's common area, which was little more than a cluttered dining space, crammed between storage lockers. Worn-out seats surrounded a metal table, covered in scattered tools and half-eaten synth food module. Jax. Orion opened a cabinet and retrieved 2 cups, filling them with something steaming from a battered dispenser. He slid one toward her. "What is this?" she asked, eyeing the drink suspiciously. "Coffee, sort of. It's a work in progress." She sniffed. The liquid, grimacing. "It smells like cryogen mist." "That's the charm," he said. "Taking a sip grows on you." Kaida didn't touch her cup. Instead, her attention wandered to the cluttered room tools, spare parts, and scraps of circuitry littered every surface. The ship felt lived in a stark contrast to the sterile utilitarian craft she was used to. "You live like this?" she asked. "Hey, don't judge the star-born relic. She's been through a lot, like her owner. And you've survived in this. I'm amazed it hasn't fallen apart." "Jax." Orion grinned. "She's tougher than she looks, kind of like you." The comment caught her off guard. It wasn't flirtatious or mocking, just a matter of fact. Kaida glanced at him, unsure how to respond. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said eventually. "You should," he replied. The hum of the engine shifted slightly, a subtle vibration that Kaida immediately noticed. She straightened her instincts, flaring. "What was that, Jack?" Orion frowned, his light-hearted demeanor vanishing. He moved to a console on the wall, studying the display. Looks like we've got a tail. Someone must have tagged us with a quantum tag. How did you miss that? She demanded, stepping beside him. Hey, I'm not a miracle worker, he shot back. They must have tagged us during the launch. I'll shake them. Kaida's eyes narrowed. You'd better. Jax. Orion dashed to the cockpit with Kaida close behind. The proximity alarm blared as the ship's scanners picked up a pursuing vessel. Jax, Orion's hands, flew over the controls, adjusting the ship's trajectory. The screen displayed their pursuer, a sleek, predatory craft painted matte black, with silhouette menacing against the backdrop of hyperspace. They're fast, Jax, Orion muttered. They're bounty hunters, Kaida said. They're always fast. Any brilliant ideas? She studied the screen, her mind racing. You said this ship's tough. How tough? Jax. Orion hesitated. Tough enough. Why? Because they'll expect us to run, so we won't. His eyes widened. You want to fight them in this? Do you have a better idea? I was thinking. We don't die. But sure. Let's try your plan, Kaida smirked. Don't worry, human. I've done this before. Jax. Orion muttered something under his breath about regretting his life choices, but he complied, bringing the ship out of hyperspace. The pursuing craft closed the distance quickly, its weapons charging. Kaida moved to a weapons panel, activating the ship's modest defenses. This is pathetic, she muttered. Hey, she's not a warship, Jax, Orion said defensively. The enemy ship opened fire, plasma bolts streaking past them. Jax Orion maneuvered the starborn relic with surprising skill, dodging the worst of the blasts. Kaida took aim with the ship's cannons, her reflexes honed from years of experience. The first shot connected, grazing the enemy ship's wing. Not bad. Jax. Orion said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Shut up and fly, Kaida snapped. He grinned, throwing the ship into a sudden roll that sends Kaida stumbling, but forced the enemy ship to overshoot. Taking advantage of the moment, Kaida fired again, this time hitting the enemy's engines. The pursuing craft faltered, its system sparking as it began to drift. Nice shot, Jax, Orion said, leveling the starborn relic and accelerating away. Kaida exhaled her grip on the controls, relaxing. You're insane, Jax, Orion added, glancing at her. Maybe she admitted. For a moment they sat in silence, the tension easing Jax. Orion leaned back, his grin returning. So he said, about that coffee. Kaida rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress the faint smirk tugging at her lips. Against all odds, she had to admit this human might not be entirely useless. The starborn relic floated in the vast expanse of space, its engines humming a low, uneven rhythm. Inside, the ship's common area was dimly lit with faint blue light from a viewport casting jagged shadows on the walls. The room smelled of metal, burnt wiring, and something else Kaida couldn't quite place, something earthy and slightly acrid. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Kaida sat stiffly at the table, her posture tense in her hand, resting near the vibroblade strap to her thigh. Her black eyes followed every move Jax Orion made, as he rummaged through cabinets that looked as though they might fall apart at any moment. Do you even know what you're looking for? She asked, her voice sharp. Breakfast, Jax. Orion replied cheerfully. He pulled out a canister and shook it. A dull rattle came from within. Well, what passes for it around here? Kaida raised an eyebrow. I don't trust anything that comes out of that cabinet, Jax. Orion glanced over his shoulder, a crooked grin on his face. You trusted my flying. That worked out. Barely. He laughed, shaking the canister one more time before pouring its contents into a pan that looked as battered as the rest of the ship. The concoction sizzled, releasing a faintly synthetic smell. Kaida's nose wrinkled, but she said nothing. She'd eaten worse in the past, and in far worse company. You got a name for this sludge? She asked. Breakfast. Special. Jax. Orion said, turning back to the pan, guaranteed to taste almost like food, or close enough if you don't think too hard about it. That's not reassuring. Welcome to the Starborn Relic, he said with a dramatic flourish. Nothing's perfect, but everything works, mostly. Kaida leaned back, her gaze drifting to the viewport. The stars outside seemed impossibly distant, cold, and indifferent to the chaos of the galaxy. She found herself wondering just for a moment what it might be like to disappear into that void, to stop running, to stop fighting. But that wasn't her path. The sound of a plate clattering on the table snapped her back. Jax. Orion had set down two mismatched metal plates, each piled high with a pale rubbery substance that faintly resembled scrambled eggs. There you go, he said, sliding into the sea to cross from her dig-in. Kaida stared at the food. What's in this? Jax. Orion shrugged. Nutrient-paste protein powder, a little seasoning. It's good for you. That's not what I asked. You'll survive, he said, grinning. Probably. Her eyes narrowed, but she picked up a fork and poked at the meal. It jiggled slightly. She took a cautious bite, chewing slowly. The texture was odd, and the flavor was non-existent. This is awful, she said flatly. Jax. Orion smirked, shoveling a forkful into his mouth. It's not supposed to be good. It's supposed to keep you alive. Big difference. She set the fork down, folding her arms. What's the point of surviving if you have to eat this? In retrospective, he said, gesturing with his fork. After a meal like this, anything else will taste amazing. Even ration bars or engine grease, she muttered. Jax. Orion chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You're funny. I didn't expect that. I'm not trying to be funny. Even better. Kaida let the silence stretch, watching Jax Orion as he finished his meal with an ease that bordered on unsettling. He wasn't like anyone she'd encountered before. Most people, when faced with someone like her, were either terrified or calculating. Jax. Orion, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered. She finally broke the quiet. You're taking this pretty well. Taking what? Well, me, she said simply. The fact that you've got the galaxy's most wanted assassin sitting at your table, most people would be terrified. Jax. Orion shrugged. I don't scare easily. Besides, you don't seem like you're going to kill me. Yet, she said, her tone unreadable. He grinned. See? That's what I like about you, always keeping me on my toes. Before Kaida could reply, a sharp alarm blared through the ship. The sound was piercing, cutting through the low hum of the engines. Jax. Orion's grin vanished. Proximity alert. Kaida was already on her feet, hand on her vibroblade. What is it? Someone's tailing us, he said, rushing to the cockpit. Kaida followed her pulse, quickening. The cockpit was cramped with wires hanging loose from the ceiling, in a control panel that looked like it had been pieced together from 5 different ships. Jax Orion slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. The screen flickered to life, displaying a ship closing in fast. Its design was bulky and angular, with heavy weaponry mounted on its sides. Pirates. Jax. Orion muttered. Of course. Kaida said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. They must have picked up the quantum tag signal. Jax. Orion said, adjusting the ship's trajectory. Looks like they're planning to cash in on that bounty of yours. More likely they'll strip the ship for parts and leave us to suffocate. Kaida said, leaning over his shoulder to study the screen. Always the optimist. Jax. Orion replied. The pirate ship fired its first salvo, a barrage of plasma bolts that sizzled against the starborn relic's shields. The ship shuddered violently, throwing Kaida off balance. Shields are at 50%. Jax. Orion said, gripping the controls tightly. This might get bumpy. You think? Kaida snapped, pulling herself into the gunner's seat. She activated the weapon system, her fingers dancing across the console. The starborn relic's cannons roared to life, firing a volley of plasma rounds at their pursuer. Most missed, but one struck the pirate ship's hull, leaving a scorch mark. Not bad, Jax, Orion said, glancing at her. Don't get cocky, she replied, adjusting her aim. The pirate ship fired again, a well-aimed shot that slammed into the starborn relic's rear thrusters. Warning lights flared on the console, and the engine sputtered. We're losing power, Jax. Orion said, his voice tight. Then stop running, Kaida said. Excuse me, bring us closer. They won't expect it. Jax. Orion hesitated, then nodded. You're the boss. The starborn relic veered sharply, hurtling toward the pirate ship. The sudden maneuver caught their pursuers off guard, and their weapons fire faltered. Kaida seized the opportunity. She fired a single precise shot that struck the pirate ship's main weapon system. The explosion rippled across its hull, disabling its cannons. Direct hit. Jax, Orion said, a note of awe in his voice. The pirate ship veered off, smoke trailing from its engines. Kaida watched it retreat, her hands still steady on the controls. Jax. Orion let out a long breath, leaning back in his seat. Well, that was fun. Kaida stood brushing past him. You call that fun? I call it surviving, he said, turning his chair to face her. You're good at this. I've had practice, she replied, walking toward the common area. Jax. Orion watched her go, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't say it aloud, but he was starting to realize that having Kaida Enrule on his ship might not be such a bad thing after all. The starborn relic limped through the quiet void of space, its engines wheezing from the pirate attack. The ship's interior reflected the toll. The lights flickered intermittently, and a faint acrid smell of burned wiring hung in the air. Kaida leaned against the wall of the common area, her sharp eyes on Jax Orion as he worked beneath an exposed panel. Jax Orion's jump from the tangle of wires he wrestled with, illuminating his grease-streaked face. Remind me again, she said dryly, arms crossed. Why I trusted you to get us out alive. Because I'm an amazing pilot, Jax, Orion replied, his voice muffled by the panel. He yanked a wire free with a grunt, holding it up triumphantly, before frowning. Or lucky depends on how you look at it. Lucky would imply skill had nothing to do with it. Kaida shot back, her tone laced with skepticism. Harsh, Jax, Orion said, tossing the wire over his shoulder. He wiped his hands on his already filthy shirt and stood giving her a crooked grin. But fair, but fair. Kaida's expression didn't change, though the faintest flicker of amusement danced behind her dark eyes. The ship suddenly jolted, throwing Jack's Orion off balance. A low grinding hum owed from the engine room. Kaida's hand instinctively went to her vibro blade. It didn't sound like luck, she said, already moving toward the cockpit. Jack's Orion hurried after her, muttering, "Could be luck. Just bad luck." The cockpit was bathed in a cold blue light as warnings blinked across the console. Jack's Orion slid into the pilot's chair and tapped at the screen, his confident demeanor slipping into something more serious. "Engine 2 is overheating," he muttered. "I thought I patched that last orbit wave." "You thought?" Kaida asked, incredulous. "Hey, this ship's held together by ingenuity and good intentions, Jax," Orion said, flipping a switch. The grinding noise subsided, though the ship still shuddered, as if protesting its own existence. "And she's still flying, isn't she?" "Defined flying," Kaida said, her tone sharp. Before Jax. Orion could reply. A new alarm blared. This one was different, high-pitched and insistent. Kaida's hand tightened on the back of his chair. "What? Now, Jax." Orion's face hardened as he checked the display. "Incoming ship, small fast, no transponder. Looks like they're running silent." "Bounty hunters," Kaida said immediately. "Jax." Orion nodded grimly. "Has to be. Whoever tagged us with that quantum tag wasn't done." Kaida leaned closer to the viewport, scanning the void for any sign of their pursuers. "Can we outrun them?" "Not like this, Jax," Orion admitted, gesturing to the damage report flashing on the screen. "But I've got an idea." "Don't like the way you said that," Kaida said, her eyes narrowing. "You haven't heard it yet, Jax," Orion replied, standing abruptly. He pointed toward the storage bay. "You're good with weapons, right?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Obviously. Perfect," he said, already moving toward the bay. "We're going to need them." The storage bay was a chaotic jumble of crates, spare parts, and outdated equipment. "Jax." Orion shoved aside a stack of broken panels, revealing a hidden compartment. He pried it open with a grunt, revealing an assortment of weaponry, some pristine, others clearly salvaged. Kaida knelt beside the cache, her sharp gaze evaluating the arsenal. She picked up a compact neutron carbine, testing its weight before setting it aside. "Where did you get all this?" she asked, her voice cold, Jax. Orion shrugged. She turned there, some of it's trade, some of it's not. Her gaze lingered on him, but she didn't press further. Instead, she selected a lightweight rifle and several energy cells, tucking them into the holsters on her belt. "You're sure this plan of yours will work?" she asked. "Nope, Jax," Orion said, grabbing a small cylindrical device from the pile. He held it up with a grin. "But it's going to be fun." "Your idea of fun is going to get us both killed," Kaida said, rising to her full height. "Hey, Jax," Orion said, tossing her the device. She caught it effortlessly, turning it over in her hands. "A disruptor charge." Specifically tuned to fry targeting systems," he explained. "If we're lucky, it'll give us enough time to lose them. And if we're not lucky, then I hope you're a better shot than you are a cook." "Jax," Orion said, already heading back to the cockpit. The pursuing ship came into view. Pulse cycles later, a sleek predatory craft painted in black and gray. The angular design spoke of speed and lethality, and its weapons were already locking onto the starborn relic. "Here they come." "Jax," Orion said, his voice tight. Kaida slid into the gunner's seat, her fingers steady on the controls. Keep us steady. No promises, Jax, Orion replied, sending the starborn relic into a sudden dive. The pursuing ship followed plasma fire streaking past them. Kaida fired back her shots. Precise, she hit the enemy ship's shields, but they held firm. We're not going to win this outright. Jax, Orion said, then stop wasting time and get me in position. Kaida snapped. Working on it, he said, pulling the ship into a sharp turn. The starborn relic groaned under the strain, but the maneuver brought them alongside the enemy craft. Now Jax, Orion shouted. Kaida hurled the disruptor charge. It tumbled through space before attaching itself to the enemy ship's hull. A moment later, it detonated in a burst of blue energy, and the enemy craft's targeting systems flickered and went dark. Direct hit, Kaida said, a rare note of satisfaction in her voice. See, told you it worked, Jax, Orion said, accelerating away from the disabled ship. We're not out of this yet, Kaida warned. The enemy ship struggled to recover its weapons, firing sporadically. Jax Orion pushed the starborn relic to its limits, weaving through an asteroid field that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Are you insane? Kaida shouted, as the ship narrowly avoided a massive chunk of rock. Maybe, Jax, Orion replied, grinning despite the chaos. They burst out of the asteroid field. Moments later, the enemy ship still trailing behind, but its movements were erratic, its systems clearly damaged. They're falling back. Jax, Orion said, his voice filled with relief. For now, Kaida said she watched the enemy ship disappear into the distance, her expression unreadable. Jax. Orion leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. Well, that was fun. You have a terrible definition of fun, Kaida said, standing. Admit it. Jax, Orion said, his grin returning. You're impressed. She glanced at him, her lips curving into the faintest smirk not bad for a human. As she walked away, Jax. Orion watched her, his grin softening. For the first time, he wondered if there might be more to Kaida than the assassin the galaxy feared. And for the first time in years, Kaida wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone. The starborn relic floated in the stillness of space, the vast dark expanse surrounding it like an unspoken threat. The stars outside the viewport twinkled coldly, indifferent to the struggles of those who dared traverse the void. Inside, the ship hummed faintly, the sound uneven, almost hesitant, as if it too questioned whether it could keep going. Kaida stood near the observation window, arms crossed, her eyes locked on the endless sea of stars. The dim blue glow from the viewport bathed her green skin in soft light, highlighting the sharp contours of her face. She felt the weight of the silence pressing down, a kind of isolation that never sat comfortably. She caught her reflection in the glass, scarred, hard, and unrelenting. Her black eyes held no warmth, only a piercing coldness honed by years of survival. The faint scars along her jaw seemed more prominent under the harsh light. They weren't just marks of past battles. They were memories etched into her skin, reminders of the lives she'd taken, the lives she'd lost. The sound of Jax. Orion's footsteps broke the silence, each step echoing faintly in the cramped corridors. He entered the room with his usual casual energy, a steaming cup in each hand. His clothes were rumpled as always, his hair sticking up in a way that looked more intentional than accidental. But there was a tension in his posture, a slight weariness in his eyes that he tried to mask with his usual grin. You keep staring out there like that, and you're going to start thinking, the galaxy makes sense, he said. Holding out one of the cups, Kaida glanced at him, her expression unreadable. It makes sense. You just don't like the answers, Deep Jax, Orion said, nodding as he handed her the cup, bleak but deep. She hesitated, then took the drink. The warmth seeped into her fingers momentarily, cutting through the cold air of the ship. She sniffed it suspiciously before taking a cautious sip. Still awful, she said, setting the cup down on the nearby ledge. Hey, it's an acquired taste. Jax, Orion said, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her. He sipped his own cup without complaint, staring at the stars with a faint smile. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the kind of silence that carried unspoken questions neither of them was ready to ask. What were you thinking about, Jax? Orion asked finally, breaking the quiet. Kaida didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained on the stars, her thoughts distant. The past, she said at last. Jax, Orion tilted his head, curious but careful care to share. No, her tone was sharp, but not as cold as it could have been. Fair enough, he said, setting his cup down. The past can be overrated anyway. Mine's not exactly a bestseller. That earned him a glance. You talk about running a lot. What are you running from, Jax? Orion chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. A lot of things. People I've pissed off, mistakes. I've made the usual. Kaida studied him for a moment. His smile was still there, but it felt like armor, thin and brittle. You don't strike me as the kind who regrets much, she said. Maybe not. Jax, Orion admitted, leaning back on his elbows, but that doesn't mean I don't carry it. The ship jolted suddenly, spilling a bit of Jax Orion's drink onto the floor. Both of them tensed, the moment shattered. What now? Kaida said, already moving toward the cockpit. Jax Orion scrambled to his feet, following close behind. If it's pirates again, I'm charging rent. The cockpit was a mess of blinking lights and flickering displays. Jax. Orion slid into the pilot's chair, his hands moving quickly across the controls. Kaida stood behind him, her sharp eyes scanning the readouts. Proximity alert, Jax, Orion said, frowning. But it's not a ship, what is it? Kaida asked, her tone clip. Jax. Orion tapped the screen, bringing up a visual. Outside, the stars seemed to twist and bend, unnaturally warping around a faintly glowing mass. A spike, he said. Looks like an anomaly. Might be a rogue planet, or a collapsed station. Kaida frowned. Or a trap, always the optimist. Jax, Orion muttered, adjusting the ship's trajectory. The anomaly grew larger on the screen, its swirling energy radiating an almost hypnotic pole. The starborn relic shuddered, the hum of its engines deepening as the ship fought against the gravitational forces. This is bad. Jax, Orion said, his voice losing its usual levity. When you get us clear, Kaida asked, her hand instinctively resting on the back of his chair. Working on it. Jax. Orion set his fingers flying over the controls, but this thing's got a strong pull. If we get any closer, we might not have enough power to escape. The ship lurched violently, throwing Jax Orion forward against the console. Kaida grabbed the back of his chair to steady herself. Shields are dropping. Jax. Orion said, his voice tight. Then stop fighting it, Kaida said. Jax. Orion turned to her, confused. What? Use the pole, she said. "If we angle the ship right, we can slingshot around it and break free." "That's insane, Jax," Orion said, though there was no denying the logic. "Do you have a better idea?" Kaida asked, her tone icy. "Jax." Orion hesitated, then sighed. "You know, for someone who says they don't trust me, you sure give a lot of orders. Stop talking and fly," she said. He grinned, despite the tension, turning back to the controls, hold on to something. The ship tilted sharply as Jax Orion angled it toward the anomaly. The swirling mass outside filled the viewport, its glow casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. The engine screamed as Jax Orion pushed them to their limit, the ship vibrating violently under the strain. Kaida's grip on the chair tightened, her knuckles white. "Almost there." "Jax," Orion said. His voice strained. The starborn relic shot forward, skimming dangerously close to the anomaly's edge. The ship's shields flickered and failed, the hull groaning under the gravitational forces. "Come on, Jax," Orion muttered, his hands gripping the controls tightly. With a final burst of speed, the ship broke free. The anomaly shrank behind them, its pole fading into nothingness. The cockpit fell silent, except for the labored hum of the engines. Jax Orion leaned back in his chair, exhaling loudly. "Well," he said, "that was terrifying." "Not bad," Kaida said, releasing her grip on the chair. Jax Orion turned to her, his grin returning. "Is that a compliment?" "Don't let it go to your head," she said, already heading for the door. As she walked away, Jax Orion watched her with a faint smile. He didn't say it, but he was beginning to understand her a little more. With the cold exterior and sharp words, there was someone worth fighting for, and for the first time in a long while, Kaida felt the same. The starborn relic limped through space, its hull battered, but holding steady. The faint hum of the engines had steadied into a low rhythmic pulse, a sound that was both reassuring and foreboding. Kaida sat at the common area's table, methodically sharpening her vibro blade. The scrape of the whetstone echoed faintly, filling the silence. Jax Orion entered, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better sol arcs. His jacket was gone, replaced by a tank top smudge with suit. He leaned against the doorway, his grin subdued but still present. "Engines are stable for now," he said. "No promises on the long term." Kaida didn't look up. "Your long-term plans seem to involve almost dying every other chron cycle. That's what keeps things exciting." "Jax," Orion replied, tossing the rag onto the table as he sat across from her. "Committed you be bored without me." Kaida paused, mid-swipe, her black eyes meeting his. "Don't flatter yourself, human. I've seen enough chaos to last a lifetime." "Yeah, but I make it fun," he said, leaning back with a smirk. Before she could respond, the ship jolted slightly, a quiet thunk reverberating through the hull. Both of them froze. Kaida's hand immediately went to her vibro blade, and Jax. Orion's grin vanished. "That wasn't me," he said. Rising quickly, Kaida was already moving her footsteps, silent as she approached the cockpit. "Jax, Orion followed his usual nonchalance, replaced with focused urgency. When they reached the cockpit, the screens were flashing faint proximity warnings. "Jax." Orion slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the controls. "Something just docked with us," he said, his voice low. "What kind of something?" Kaida asked, standing over him, or posture tense, but friendly. He muttered, pulling up the external cameras. The screen showed a small ship latched onto their hull like a parasite. Its sleek angular design was unmistakable. "Bounty hunters," Kaida said, her voice sharp. "Of course it's bounty hunters, Jax," Orion muttered. "Can't we get a break?" Kaida ignored him, her focus narrowing. "How long until they breach?" "Not long, Jax." Orion replied, their ships cutting through the hatch. He turned her steps, deliberate, as she headed for the storage bay. "Arm yourself." "What about you?" he called after her. She glanced back, her expression cold and determined. "I don't need luck." The storage bay was dim-lit only by a single flickering overhead light. Kaida moved quickly, grabbing a neutron carbine from the weapon cache and loading it with practiced efficiency. The faint hiss of the rifle powering up was oddly comforting Jax. Orion appeared moments later, holding a smaller ion disruptor that looked more like a relic than a weapon. "That's your plan?" Kaida asked, eyeing the ion disruptor. "It works," he said defensively. Most of the time, she asked, echoing his earlier excuse. "Exactly," he said with a grin, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. The sound of metal screeching against metal filled the air, followed by a loud clang. Kaida's expression hardened. "They're in," she said, stepping forward. "Great, Jax," Orion said, falling in behind her, ladies first. The bounty hunters moved with precision, their armored bus clanging against the Starborn Relic's floor. There were 3 of them, each clad in dark, reinforced suits, designed to withstand ion disruptor fire. Their helmets obscured their faces, but the red lights on their visors glowed menacingly in the dim corridors. Kaida waited in the shadows, her breathing steady. She held the neutron carbine loosely, her posture relaxed but ready. "Jax." Orion crouched behind her, trying not to make noise as he adjusted his grip on his ion disruptor. The first bounty hunter stepped into view, his rifle sweeping the corridor. Kaida moved swiftly, her rifle firing a single precise shot that struck his shoulder. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon clattering to the ground. Before the others could react, Kaida was already moving, her movements fluid and precise. He ducked under a barrage of ion disruptor fire, closing the distance with deadly efficiency. Her vibroblade found its mark, slicing through the second hunter's armor. At a vulnerable seam, Jax. Orion fired at the third hunter, his shot going wide. The hunter turned, raising his weapon, but Kaida was faster. She grabbed the fallen bounty hunter's rifle and fired, hitting the remaining attackers square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, the red lights on his visor flickering and dying. The silence that followed was deafening. Jax Orion straightened, lowering his ion disruptor. "Remind me not to get on your bad side. You're always on my bad side," Kaida said, wiping her vibroblade on one of the fallen hunter's armor. "Jax." Orion grinned fair. She ignored him, crouching over one of the bounty hunters. Her sharp eyes scanned the insignia on his shoulder, a black crescent with a red claw mark slashing through it. Her expression darkened. "Their void covenant," she said, her voice low. "Is that supposed to mean something to me, Jax?" Orion asked. "It means they're not just after the bounty," she said, standing. "The void. Covenant doesn't hunt for money. They hunt for control." "Jax." Orion frowned. "Control of what?" Kaida said. Simply Jax. Orion's grin faltered. "Great. So we're up against a galaxy-spanning criminal network, no big deal." "We're not up against anything," Kaida said, her tone cold. This is my fight, not yours, funny. Jax, Orion said, leaning against the wall. Because last I checked, they just breached my ship. She glared at him, her expression icy. You don't understand what you're getting into. Maybe not, he said, his tone surprisingly serious. But I'm in it now. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation pressed down on them. The silence, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, Kaida sighed, sheathing her vibro blade. You're an idiot. I get that a lot. Jax. Orion said, his grin returning. She shook her head, but there was the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. The bounty hunter's ship, detached from the star-born relic, drifting lifelessly into the void. Jax. Orion watched it through the viewport, his arms crossed. Think they'll send more? He asked. They always do, Kaida said, standing beside him. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Then we'll be ready. She raised an eyebrow. Yeah, Jax, Orion said, his grin widening. You're not getting rid of me that easily, Kaida huffed, but there was no malice in the sound. I should have left you back at Nivra Terminal. Maybe, Jax. Orion set his tone light, but then who'd fix your ship? She rolled her eyes, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. The stars outside shimmered endless and unknowable. For the first time in years, Kaida didn't feel entirely alone. The star-born relic coasted through the quiet stretch of space. The stars, a scattered sea of light around it. Inside the ship, silence felt heavier, weighted by the aftermath of the Void Covenant attack. Kaida sat at the common area table, dismantling and cleaning her neutron carbine. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative, but her expression was hard as stone. Across from her, Jax. Orion was leaning back in his chair, tossing a small round part from the ship's engine up and down. His usual humor was muted, though the occasional glimmer of it surfaced in the way he caught the part with exaggerated flair. So, Jax, Orion said, breaking the silence. Do you always leave a trail of bodies wherever you go? Or is this just my lucky orbit? Wave. Kaida didn't look up. If you want to back out, now's your chance. Jax. Orion set the part down, leaning forward with an earnest look out. Are you kidding? I live for this kind of thing. But if I'm going to keep risking my neck, I figure I deserve answers. She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-motion, her sharp black eyes flicked to him, gauging his seriousness. What do you want to know? For starters, Jax, Orion said, resting his chin on his hands. Why does the Void Covenant want you so badly? Kaida's jaw tightened. She finished reassembling the rifle, setting it aside with deliberate care because I used to work for them. Jax. Orion blinked, leaning back. Wait, what? You were? Void Covenant? For a time she set her tone cold. The Void Covenant has a habit of finding people like me, people who are good at killing and bad at everything else. They trained me, gave me targets, turned me into their weapon. I was good at it. Jax. Orion frowned. But you left. I did more than leave. Kaida set her voice low. I killed one of their high-ranking enforcers, someone they thought was untouchable. They didn't just lose a killer. They lost their leverage. What kind of leverage? Kaida's lips thinned, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. My family. Jax. Orion sat up straighter, his expression softening. They used your family against you. they did," she said, her voice sharp but brittle. "The tailies, sorry, don't have much left. Our numbers are too small, scattered across the galaxy, the void. Covenant found my parents and threatened to make them disappear unless I worked for them. I had no choice." Jax Orion's usual grin was gone. He looked at her with a quiet intensity, his hands folded in front of him. "What happened to your family?" "They're dead," Kaida said flatly. "The Void Covenant made sure of that after I turned on them. Now all they want is to make an example of me, to remind the galaxy what happens when someone defies them." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, a low, steady reminder of their isolation. "I'm sorry, Jax," Orion said finally. Kaida's eyes flicked to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Don't be. I've had a long time to make peace with it. Jax." Orion leaned back, crossing his arms. "So what's the plan? You just keep running forever?" "I don't run," she said, her tone icy. "I survive, and when the time comes, I'll face them on my terms. Well, Jax," Orion said, a faint grin returning. "Guess I'd better stick around then. Can't let you have all the fun." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You're not obligated to help me. You could leave. Go back to whatever you were doing before." "Sure, Jax," Orion said, shrugging. "But what kind of guy would I be if I ditched you now? Besides, you'd probably stab me in my sleep." For the first time in soul arcs, Kaida let out a soft chuckle. It was brief, almost reluctant, but it was there. The cockpit alarms jolted them both out of the moment. Jax Orion bolted to the controls, his hands flying over the console as red warning lights blinked across the screen. "What is it?" Kaida asked, already on her feet. "Another ship," Jax Orion said, his voice tense. "Small fast, and headed straight for us. More bounty hunters?" Kaida asked Jax. Orion frowned. "No, they're not broadcasting any ID. Whoever they are, they don't want to be recognized." The ship appeared on the viewport, its sleek black hull glinting faintly against the stars. Kaida's heart sank as she recognized the shape. "It's syndicated," she said grimly. The starborn relic shuddered as the Void Covenant ship fired a warning shot across its bow. "Jax." Orion's hands tightened on the controls. "They're not messing around," he muttered. "Shields are still recovering from the last fight. We can't take them head-on." "They won't give us a choice," Kaida said, grabbing her neutron carbine. "Jax." Orion glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "So what do we do?" Kaida hesitated, her mind racing. The Void Covenant wanted her alive. They wouldn't risk destroying the ship outright. But Jax Orion, he was expendable. "You can't stay here," she said. "What?" "You're here for me, not you," she said firmly. "Take the escape pod and get out of here. They won't follow." Jax Orion stared at her, his expression hardening. "Are you seriously telling me to run?" "It's not running," Kaida snapped. "It's survival. You've helped me enough. This isn't your fight." "Jax." Orion stood, his hands bowled into fists. "You don't get to decide that. If they take you, you think I'm just going to fly off and forget this ever happened. That's not who I am." Kaida opened her mouth to argue, but the determination in his eyes stopped her. She realized with a pang of discomfort that he wasn't going to leave. The ship shook again, the Void Covenant vessel locking onto their hull. The lights flickered as a boarding alarm blared through the corridors. Kaida's grip on a rifle tightened. "You're an idiot, yeah, Jax," Orion said, picking up his ion disruptor. "But I'm your idiot." The Void Covenant hunters moved swiftly, their boots pounding against the metal floors as they spread out through the ship. Kaida and Jax. Orion waited in the engine room, their backs pressed against opposite walls. "You take the two on the right," Kaida whispered. "I'll handle the rest. Handle them." "How?" "Jax," Orion asked, raising an eyebrow. "Efficiently," she said. The door slid open, and the first two hunters stepped through. Kaida moved like lightning, her neutron carbine firing two quick shots that hit their marks. Jax Orion ducked as ion disruptor fire streak passed him, returning fire with surprising accuracy. The fight was brutal and fast. Kaida took out another hunter with her vibro blade, her movements precise and deadly. Jax Orion provided cover, his ion disruptor, keeping the remaining hunters at bay. When the last Void Covenant soldier fell, the ship went eerily quiet. Kaida stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Jax Orion leaned against the wall, his ion disruptor dangling from his hand. "That was intense," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's not over," Kaida said, her eyes narrowing. The Void Covenant ship was still attached to the Starborn relic, its presence a looming threat. But before Kaida could formulate a plan, Jax Orion stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I've got an idea," he said. "What kind of idea?" she asked suspiciously. "The kind that works. Trust me," he said, flashing her a faint grin. Minutes later, Jax Orion sat at the Starborn Relic's console, his fingers flying over the controls. Kaida stood behind him, watching as he accessed the Void Covenant ship's systems through their boarding connection. "You can hack their systems?" she asked. "Not exactly," Jax Orion admitted, "but I can overload them." A sudden explosion rocked the Void Covenant ship, its lights flickering as fire erupted from its engines. Jax Orion grinned. "See, told you at work, at..." Kaida shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You're impossible, and you're stuck with me, Jax," Orion said, as the Void Covenant ship broke away, spiraling into the void. The Starborn relic accelerated into hyperspace, leaving the danger behind. For the first time in years, Kaida felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel: hope. As the ship drifted in the calm of deep space, Kaida sat across from Jax Orion in the common area. "You could have left," she said quietly. "Yeah," Jax Orion said, meeting her gaze. "But I didn't." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Jax." Orion smiled. "Anytime." For the first time in a long while, Kaida felt like she wasn't running alone. And for Jax Orion, the stars outside seemed just a little brighter.